Okay, so we continue again here in Ner Avram, sorry, the idea of Avodas HaParsha, taking a small aspect of the Parshas HaShavua and trying to see how it can guide us in our Avodas Hashem. Looking at it through the eyes of the Mefarshim, who, so to speak, unpack it. So this week's small piece is part of the mitzvah of Bikurim. Okay, the mitzvah of Bikurim, which we have at the beginning of Parshas Savo, on one hand seems like one of the smaller agricultural laws. In other words, in terms of the quantities, even though Truma also originally could just be by a little bit, Bikurim, the way it's described, right, Rashi brings it down, somebody went out to his field, he sees that fig that became ripe, he sees something else that became ripe, a pomegranate, he ties a little ribbon around it, and okay, whether you say declare it as Bikurim just then or also after you harvest it. And then when you look at the Mishnayos and Bikurim, the whole description of the procession that would go up to Yerushalayim with the Bikurim, towns would gather together and they would go, and there was music, and it was something very big, a big procession, music. The Medrash brings down here is actually mandated, right? The idea of Shira, we'll see. And the pasuk that sums it up, before moving on to Vidui Meiser, it says, "V'samachta b'chol hatov asher nosan lecha Hashem Elokecha leveisecha," and you will rejoice with all of the good, or in all of the good that Hashem, your God, gave you into your family. Atah v'alevi v'ager asher b'kirbecha. You and the Levi and the Ger who is there with you. Now, the Tiferes Shlomo of Radomsk, who is going to be the main source we're looking at tonight. There is very little left nowadays of the Radomsk Chassidus, but in Poland before the war, it was very, very big, and it had a very large network of yeshivas, which were called Keser Torah. There was even a Torah publication of Chidushei Torah called Keser Torah, which was there. And the Tiferes Shlomo was both a Rav and a Posek, and also a Chassidish Rebbe. So you can read the interesting descriptions about it. There's an interesting book. They wrote it in the English translation. It's called The Chassid from Hamburg. It's about a Yeke from Hamburg who somehow felt this draw to become a Chassid, and he ended up in Radomsk. So my wife's a Yeke. She thinks it's a sad story. I'm more of a Polish Chassid. I think it's a happy story. So you can see how you read it. Yeah. So he says like this. He says, the mitzvahs, and we referred to this last week, are called by the Zohar HaKadosh itin, which in Aramaic means eitzas. Every mitzvah is guiding you toward Kirvas Elokim, toward Ahavas Hashem, toward Yiras Shamayim. Sometimes the Torah is more explicit about what particular mitzvahs do. For example, the mitzvah of tzitzis. It says, Ura'isam also, you'll see it, Uzchartem es kol mitzvahs Hashem, V'asisam also, will help you remember the mitzvahs of Hashem and perform them. Tefillin says, L'man tiyeh Toras Hashem b'ficha. Right? Tefillin will help you be someone who has the words of Torah constantly in your mouth. It says here in Bikurim, that's what the Torah is telling you as well. When you do the mitzvah of Bikurim, it is teaching you how to be sameach. It is teaching you how to be happy. Okay, now that is really what everyone's looking for. They tell me that there's some lecturer now in Harvard whose specialty is happiness. And his lecture is the most packed of any lecture in the university. Because everybody wants to be happy. I don't know what or how, or if he can teach you. We know that simcha is something important in Judaism. There's a theory in linguistics that if a culture has many words for the same thing, it's very important in that culture. Right? The famous example, Eskimos, many words for snow because right, it makes a big difference in your life as an Eskimo what type of snow it is. So Jews have, right, simcha, gila, rina, ditza, chedva, sason, countless words about this idea. But the question is, how? How does a person, become happy? Oftentimes when you see in the Torah, it tells you to be happy. Yontiv, right, v'samachta b'chagecha, that makes it even harder to be happy. Right? Now I'm going to get in trouble for not being happy. They're telling me to be happy, and I can't, I don't know how. So
Sachs makes it different, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
Yeah.
There's happiness and there's joy.
Oh.
Happiness is the individual. I'm a happy guy because, the stocks went up and so
Yeah.
on. And joy is because I'm part of a community.
Something that's ongoing.
It's ongoing, but you have to join with others in it. By
Can't be
Bikurums,
done alone.
With the Levi, the Ger, the Yosem, and Yontif, you have to...
Right. Ata mesameach es sheli, ani asameach es shelcha. Yeah. So he brings two approaches here. He brings many approaches. We're going to look at two of them, and we're going to look at how it's echoed in other Sfarim as well, as to how it teaches you to be happy. I'll refer to one in the beginning. We'll get back to it. He says, when it emphasizes, "V'samachta b'chol hatov asher nosan lecha Hashem Elokecha," you will be happy in all of the good that Hashem gave to you. He said, let's get real. Not everybody who brought Bikurim was a wealthy man. Some people had some really pitiful little amounts of Bikurim to bring up. Right? If you lived far outside Yerushalayim, you couldn't bring fresh fruit. You would bring dried fruit. You would try to dress up your basket with fresher fruit to make it look nice. We know the Mishnah describes that the wealthy people brought their Bikurim in gold and silver, right, in containers. The poor people brought in baskets woven of reeds and Ahavas and these things. So it's kind of hard to be happy when you have some little homestead out in the Galil and you schlepped your way up with a few sorry-looking raisins and a few other things that you put in there in this little basket. And there's some other guys coming up there with the Rolls Royce of Bikurim. And it's individual. V'somachta b'chol hatov. You will be happy in kol hatov. How? So he says, Asher nosan lecha Hashem Elokecha. This is what we call sometimes sentimental value. Right? If a person ever lost their luggage or something like this, really lost it, didn't get it back, and they ask you, okay, itemize the items in there, what were they worth? So you go through, he said, and I had an entire album of photographs. Okay, how much is that worth? Those were the only photographs of my grandparents. That was our family album. $10? $20? Priceless, right? What do you mean? It's some paper, right? It's some plastic. But the idea of the sentimental value, and especially with a gift, who it's given from, right? If a king gives you something, right? Sometimes people get these pens from, there was someplace the president signed something, gave you the pen. Right? People treasure it. Asher nosan lecha Hashem Elokecha. Every individual is able to have the joy in what they have if they recognize who it's coming from. This echoes what we find in benching, right? In Parshas Noso, when it talks about Birkas Kohanim, Yisa Hashem ponav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Hashem will favor you. Yisa Hashem maso ponim, which means favoritism. And Chazal ask, how can that be? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a kel mishpat, he does justice. So you say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, well, they bench not just on a kibetza, but on a kazayis. So therefore I favor them as well. What's going on with that? The Pasuk says in benching, V'chalta v'savatu berachta Hashem Elokecha. You eat and you'll be satisfied, and you say Birkas HaMazon. How do you measure satisfaction? So Chazal said a baseline. A kibetza of bread is that which brings the average person satisfaction. Okay, but Am Yisrael decided we're going to bench on a kazayis as well, which is about half of that. How can we do that? If the Torah says you have to be satisfied to bench, how are you doing on that which isn't satisfying? Sfas Emes answers, he says, because Am Yisrael look at the bread and they realize that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu who's giving this to me. Nosin lechem l'chol basar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me this bread. If you see Hasidim at a tish, they get that little piece of fish from the Rebbe, right? And they do it and they share it with their kids and put a little in their pocket to bring home for their wife. And what is with you people? It's from the Rebbe, right? This is from the Rebbe of all Rebbes, right? That bread that you have. Even though in terms of quantity it's a kazayas, they're so delighted. So too HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that mitzvah, which you do, it may not look like so much. It's like that little piece of fish, but it's coming from these people that love me and that are happy with what I've given them, and therefore I accept that as well. That's how that balances. So here, a person is able to have the happiness because it comes from Hashem. That's one approach. But the one we want to focus on more now is the following. He says there's something educational here. The mitzvah Bikurim is teaching us the idea of histapkus b'muot, meaning being happy with what you have. Okay, now he says you have to realize happiness really is what people are looking for. When Chazal said, Ezu Ashir Asamech Bechelko, right? Those Mishnayos where they formulated them in questions. Why'd they give it as a question? Why not just say, Asamech Bechelko Hu Ashir? Ezu Ashir, because if you ask the man in the street who's rich, their immediate answer, duh, someone with a lot of money. So you answer back, how much money? $1 million? Nowadays, $1 million, yeah. $500 million, I don't know, but you can't buy your own private jet, maybe. How much is it? And if a person has $1 billion, but his wife is angry with him, or his parents aren't speaking to him, or all the relatives who you didn't give enough money to aren't speaking to you, etc., is that what you want when you say, I want to be rich? No, that's not what I want. So what do you mean when you say you want to be rich? I want to be happy. I want to feel good. And that can be done and only done if you're sameach bechelka. So therefore he says, there's two types of shefa which come into the world. Okay? He says there's a shefa which comes from the sitra de kedusha, from the pipeline, if you'll call it, of kedusha. And that shefa satisfies a person. When a person gets things in that way, you feel happy with it. You feel good. He says that's what we refer to in benching, right? We say that it comes mituva agadol, right? Bituva agadol tamid lo chasar lonu val yechsar lonu. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us things out of His goodness, so we don't feel that we're missing, and it doesn't cause us to miss anything else. There's another type of shefa, which comes from the negative side, that other sitra, and there it's called tzmeah. It makes you thirsty. It's like drinking that salty water. The more you get, the more you want. And that's where Chazal's statement, yesh lo moneh, masayim, right? Oyev kesef, lo yizba kesef, right? A person who loves money, he'll never be satisfied with money. Ein adam meis v'chatzi tavoso biyodo. Nobody dies with even half of the things that he wants in his hand. Somebody once said they saw a bumper sticker that said, right, he who dies with the most toys wins, or something like that. I don't know. It's like there's a competing bumper sticker that says, even the rat who wins the race is still a rat. Okay, so that's important to remember. So he said that's the tzameah. So he says, therefore, he says the mitzvah of Bikurim teaches you the idea of shlemus, that you're coming to the Beis Hamikdash, and it was a particular avodah that was done there, and that so many people participated in with you. And then you feel simcha, not just in those fruits that you have, but b'chol asher lo. Suddenly now you're able to realize HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me exactly what I'm supposed to have. That which He didn't give me isn't for me. And you feel satisfied. And you reach that happiness that a person is supposed to do. That is this concept of histapkus, of ezu osher samech bechelko. That was the gift that a person would get when they brought their bikurim, and that's what they would bring home with them. It's a tremendous key for a person to be able to have. They say Rabbi Levine, right, lived right near here, that when he became more famous toward the end of his life, people would come from Chutz La'aretz, ask for a bracha, and they would walk into his little apartment there in Nachlaot, and they would be horrified. And they say, Rebbe, we'd like to buy you a better house. And he would say, my house is so nice. The walls, he says, they stop the wind. The roof stops the rain. He says, it's a great house, right? And people might laugh at it, but he was happier with his house than oftentimes that person with a mansion that wishes he could expand a bit more. The ceilings could have been higher. The windows could have been stained glass or whatever it was. He was rich. So that's what we have in terms of physical things. Now, the interesting extension, and it's a fascinating question, and there are different sides of the question, but I'm only going to follow the side that he's taking, among others. You can debate it till late at night. Does the concept of Ezu Osher HaSamech Bechelko, who is wealthy, the one who is happy with his lot, apply also to Ruchnius, to spiritual things? Most people's immediate reaction is Chas v'Shalom. Chas v'Shalom. In Ruchnius, you're always supposed to be hungry. In Ruchnius, you're always supposed to want more. In Ruchnius, whatever you've done is not enough. That is what people think. But many, many sources say otherwise. Let's look at the Tiferes Shlomo and then some others from different places. He says, Keinu gam kein binyone avodas Hashem yizbarach, bechinas hashleimus v'yistapkus, that you feel whole and happy with what you have. What does that mean? Hainu shistapek ha'odem b'ma shechonan lo elokim b'chochma bina v'das v'yira, listakel b'atzmo tomid, right? U'falkeach al kol derachav. Meaning, we are given different tools. We're given different minds, right? One person once told me, you know what I got out of my years in yeshiva? I feel guilty for the rest of my life. I said, I don't think that's the point of going to yeshiva, right? In other words, you can always see people who learned more than you, who know more than you, and you look and you say, if only, right? If only I had his mind, if only I had his heart, right? Any of these things that people look for and ask for, he says, no. You should be happy with what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you. You have a terrible memory. Okay. That's the type of learning you're supposed to be doing. It doesn't mean you don't try to remember a bit better. A friend of mine years ago, he told me he was having problems remembering anything he learned. So he decided he would ask the Eitz of the Amshin of a Rebbe Shlita. Now, the Amshin of a Rebbe, a lot of times these meetings, when you finally got one, would be in the middle of the night. Right? So he got a call at 2 o'clock in the morning, go to the Rebbe's house at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said it was this very awe-inspiring experience walking through the dark and by Dvagan at 3 in the morning. And he comes into the Rebbe and he says, I'm having problems remembering my learning. The Rebbe said, have you tried listening to recorded shiurim? Those sometimes help. He was like, what? You're not going to tell me to say a parak of Tehillim a certain amount of times or go to some mikvah someplace or anything? No, this is the mind that you have. Use tools that can be used to help your mind learn things. We're not going to give you a brain transfusion. And you have to learn to be happy with that mind that you have. He says, V'lo yamar bilvavo leimor lalos b'malis agdolim kiro yira re'eu godol mimenu basagoso v'tzidkoso. Don't spend your time thinking about that I wish I could be like him. That person's a great tzaddik, that person's a great Talmud Chacham. He says, what you're supposed to do is betumo yisalech kol hayomim. You try to maximize doing what you are, who you are, living your own life. Now, what about the Chazal that says, right, a person's supposed to say, Mosai yagiu maisai lemaisai avosai Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov. When are my deeds going to reach those of the forefathers, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Right, and that seems like kind of a hard thing to ask people to say because you're never going to get there. So he says it's true, but what that means is, just as they maximize their potential with what they had, you maximize your potential with what you have. If it's not in the power, not just of your intellect, which seems to be call it maybe a physical limited thing, but even in your kedusha, I'm not as kaddish as the Chavetz Chaim. You know, so to sit around fantasizing that I'm going to be with the kedusha of the Chavetz Chaim is wasting your time, is wasting your life. You're not living your life. And he says, V'chas v'sholom al yikane lirdof acharav chalila. And don't be jealous of other people and trying to pursue or imitate them in that way. Chazal call it, right, kina they say is rekev atzamos, it rots your bones. The word for bones, atzamos, comes from etzem, your atzmiut, your essence, who you are. If you're jealous, so you don't have yourself. Yourself decomposes before they even put you in the ground, right, when you live a life of jealousy. Yelo madregasu l'shleimosito. Feel at peace and whole with your madrega, which doesn't mean you don't keep moving on, but that's who and how you are. Yes?
Rabbi, I've found often it's not the quantity that you learn, it's who you learn and what which makes it special.
Correct.
To be the most special to learn with myself.
Correct, because there your HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with you when you're doing that v'shinantum levanecha that it says in the Torah. You're part of something very eternal and powerful, moving on that chain, right? And it doesn't matter how many you learn, like you say, and it doesn't matter even the depth of which you learn at that point. You try your best in doing that, but that is that fulfillment of the v'shinantum levanecha that's in the Torah. That's something which is very powerful. Okay, so this is what he's telling us here, and it's something that has to be fleshed out a bit. Before we try to make it a little bit more practical. And let's just broadcast ahead. This is really, really important when it comes to Yom Noraim. When it comes to Elul, right, for a person to sit around just thinking, right, that I'm not like the Chavetz Chaim, I'm not like this one, I'm not like that one. I don't know how many people do this. I do this. You stand in front of some bookcases of Sfarim, say, I'm never going to learn these before, right, the trumpet blows, so to speak. I thought maybe when I was young, I'm not going to do it, right? And it may be, okay, but you can pick up a sefer and learn. And that's much more productive than sitting there crying over those that you're not going to. So, just so we shouldn't think it's only Hasidim who write these things, okay? We try to be equal opportunity here. So, a Talmud of Rav Chaim Volozhin wrote a sefer called Menucha Kedusha. He says the following: you should know that I heard in the name of the Vilna Gaon, when it comes to things of Avodas Hashem, Milei Dishmaya, you should be happy with your lot. Certainly a person should have a desire that your heart should be able to open and contain and understand lots of Torah. And to say the statement, Masai Yagiu, Maisei Lamaisa Avosai, Mikol Mokom Tzarech Lios Sameach Bechelko Shezocha LeTorah Maisim Tovim. You're supposed to be happy with what you have. You've done a mitzvah, you've done a Maisa Tov. Look at the parallel to Bikurim. Those fruits that you bring, it says, whoever you are, however many fruits you bring, v'samachta. You should and you can be sameach with that. There's a beautiful Parshas of the Kotzker, I say over often, in Pirkei Avos, right? It says, Al Tomer she'efne eshne shema lo tipone. The standard way of explaining that Mishnah is, don't say, when I'm going to have time, I'm going to learn. Maybe you'll never get time, right? We know the scenario. The rabbi says, Joe, how come you never come to the Shiurim in Shul? Rabbi, when I retire, I'm going to come to all the Shiurim. Right now, I'm so busy, right? He retires, gets his gold watch. Unfortunately, has a heart attack the next day, never comes. The Mishnah says, no, don't put it off till then. But there's another type of explanation. The Kotzker says, Al Tomer she'efne eshne, a person might say, Ribono Shalom, I know what learning is supposed to be like. Learning is supposed to be when you're able to focus on it entirely with your mind and your heart and put yourself in there. I'm not ponui. I don't have the bandwidth. My mind is so distracted by my tzaras and all the things I have. I can't focus and I'm exhausted. If I'll go to the shir, I'll be up for 10 minutes, I'll fall asleep and I won't be able to tell you the next day what I learned. Right? When I have a life which is clear of those troubles, Eshnet, then I'll be able to learn the way learning is meant to be. Answers the Mishnah, Shema lo tipone. The way the Kotzker said it, Evshe bista lo tipone mensch. Maybe realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you that life that you have. You're a lo tipone mensch. And he tells you to learn Torah. And that learning Torah that you do, those 10 minutes of the shir before you sleep, and even the very fact that you went to the shul exhausted, and you did your 10 minutes and fell asleep, that's what you're here in this world for. That's why he constructed that life for you. Don't reject it saying because of that. Okay, so this is what one's supposed to do. Again, from the Litvische world, if we'll bring Rav Chatzkel Levenstein, right, the Mashgiach of Mir and Ponovich. So he said like this, he said this was really the mistake of Cain. Okay, Cain brought a korban, Hevel brought a korban. Hevel's korban was accepted. Cain's was not. And Vayichar l'Cain ma'od vayiplu panov. And he got very upset. And he got very sad. Okay, now the way Rav Chatzkel says is like this. Cain chorolo. Cain was upset. He was very unhappy with his state in Ruchnius. He's saying Hashem rejected me. He rejected my korban. He says, now that looks, if we would look at Cain, oh, what an Ovid Hashem. He's sitting there in his field by his rejected flax seeds, crying tears as he watches Hevel's korban accepted. Right? He says, and that's why he got sad. So he should be a big Baal Madrega, we would think, that he wants to reach such levels. He wants Hashem to accept his korban. says, Mikom Makom, nonetheless, Ra'inu she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu tovea oso al kach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him to task for this. Umora lo shematzav zeh shel nefilas ponim v'arogis v'akas al kach shemin choso enu miskabelas ein derech nechona. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him that's not the right way. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, Lama charalach, lama lafnu ponecha. Shouldn't it be obvious? He's an Oved Hashem, and his korban wasn't accepted. And therefore he's crying. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling him, don't do this. Im lo tetiv lapetach chatas rovetz. If you take that pathway of the depression and the affliction and all those things, it leads to chet, and that's exactly what happened. He said Cain went downhill until he became a murderer. So therefore this teaches us whatever situation you're in, you should accept it with happiness and with willingness. Okay, now he says certainly, as we've always said, a person still wants to grow and does grow. Nonetheless, he says this was written in the Torah to teach us this idea. So, Mesilas Yesharim, when he talks about Cheshbon HaNefesh, right, accounting, now in Elul, some people get very into Cheshbon HaNefesh. Recently, they've come in the bookstores with these little diaries for you to mark down your different Averas and your different things, and you can do, a spreadsheet and averages and all these kind of things. But people don't like doing Cheshbon HaNefesh because they say, why in the world do I want to look at how bad I am? So the Mesilas Yesharim says that there's two parts to Cheshbon HaNefesh. One part is true, to look at things you did wrong so that you will avoid them and not repeat them, but also to look at the good things that you do so that you will be able to increase them and repeat them. And, I'll add in parentheses, to rejoice in them, like he says, and to be happy. Don't just be looking at, well, I didn't do this, well, I didn't do that, but you did do this, right? And that is something that you should be full of joy with. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you the opportunity. That's the Asher Nosan Lecha. He let you do that. He gave that to you. Rav Wolbe says, it's interesting, I heard this from Rav Noach Horlowitz Shlita. He told me in the name of two of the great Bali Musar, Rav Wolbe Zatzal and Rav Zedel Epstein Zatzal, was Mashgiach in Torah Or. They said that young people especially, and I don't know the line of demarcation for young people, I think I'm still there, when they're starting out on their path of Cheshbon HaNefesh, they should start only with that part of looking at what good you've done. Only with that. Solidifying the idea that I am good, I can do good, Hashem made me good, then you can work more looking for your problem. It doesn't mean if you see a problem, you don't try to work on it. Right? But you do that, you're supposed to be able to focus on it. See, Rabbi Orlov said he was aghast. He said, but all the Sifrei Musar, are you telling me it says look and look into Averas and look at them and see deeper and deeper? Rav Obaz told him, he said, it's like a person who has these stomach pains. He comes to his doctor. He says, Doc, my stomach's killing me. He examines him. He says, I figured it out. You got an ulcer. He says, can we do anything? He said, there's an operation we could do. Great, when do I get it? He says, you don't. So why not? He says, because of your heart problems. Your heart's too weak. You couldn't make it through the operation. He said, that's what happens nowadays as well. The medicine in those Sifrei Musar is good, but until a person's heart is strong, it'll kill you. You have to first, right, recognize the good that you can do. Feel happy with the kochos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you, with the limitations. The fact that he didn't give you the Chavetz Chaim's mind, heart, etc., was because he didn't create you to be a Chavetz Chaim. And to sit there spending your time, depressed that you're not the Chavetz Chaim is not what's supposed to be. The stories we read about Gedolim enable us, inspire us to transfer it into our world with our kelim, to do what we can and to do it happily. Hopefully that'll help us do the Avodah of Elul and Rosh Hashanah with simcha and tuv levav while still growing and yearning for more.